Today we're going to be talking about a very interesting topic as we're continuing with our Law of Person series, mental illness as a factor affecting status. Okay, so um, we also going to discuss the prescribed case, which is the Lange versus Lange case. I don't know how to pronounce that, but yeah, we're going to discuss that case as well. So let's get started. Okay, so the main idea here is simple. The law generally assumes that an adult person can make their own decisions, right? So an adult can usually enter into contracts, sue or be sued, manage property, get married, draft a will, and take responsibility for wrongful acts, right? But if a person suffers from mental illness to such an extent that they cannot understand what they're doing, right? The law may still say that the person does not have the capacity to act. This purpose is not to punish them. The purpose is to protect them from being exploited and from making legal decisions they don't understand, right? For example, if a person who owns a house during a severe mental episode, they sell the house for 5,000 rand, ridiculous, right? Because they believe that the buyer is protecting the house from aliens. Would assume that this person's American. They believe in aliens. Okay, so in ordinary contract law, a signed agreement usually matters. But in the law of persons, we first ask whether the seller had the mental ability to understand the transaction, right? So did they understand that they were selling a real house? Did they understand that ownership will pass to this person that they're selling the house to? Did they understand that 5,000 Rand was the price? And then, if not, our law may treat the contract as invalid, right? So, the key test is whether the person could understand the nature and the consequences of the act at the time that the act was performed. So this is the key test, and this is very important. The law does not simply ask whether the person has a diagnosis. A diagnosis alone is not enough. The real question here is whether the mental illness affected the person's ability to understand what they were doing at the specific time. Timing is very important. So if Sarah has a mental illness but is stable and fully understands that she's buying a car, her contract may be valid, right? But if she signs the same contract during a serious episode where she does not understand that she's entering into a binding agreement, the contract may be invalid. This is why timing matters. Okay? So now let's talk about the meaning of mental illness. What does this even mean? Because in everyday life, people use the phrase mental illness so loosely, like, oh, I'm mentally ill, oh, she's mentally ill. You know, they may say, oh, that person is crazy, oh, that person is not okay upstairs. But the law needs a more careful approach, right? Legally, mental illness becomes relevant when it affects a person's ability to understand and appreciate the actions, right? So a person may be mentally ill in the medical sense, but still legally capable in certain moments, right? For example, a person with depression, we all have, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, dementia, is not automatically incapable of acting, right? So the law asks whether the condition actually prevented them from understanding the legal act, right? So mental illness affects status only when it affects capacity. I'll repeat that. Mental illness affects status only when it affects capacity. The law does not remove somebody's legal abilities merely because they have a condition. It only limits capacity when a person cannot understand what they're doing, right? and we keep talking about capacity to act. Just as a reminder, because we've spoken about this many times, or to those that are listening to this for the first time, capacity to act means the ability to perform a valid juristic act, right? A juristic act is an act intended to create legal consequences, such as signing a contract, selling property, donating money, getting married, making a will, or settling a dispute, right? So if a mentally ill person performs a juristic act while unable to understand the nature and the consequences of that act, the act is generally void. Void means legally treated as if it never properly existed. Ne? For example, if Temba signs a contract selling his laptop and he fully understands what he's doing, the contract is valid, right? But if Temba signs the same contract while believing that the laptop is a magical object and that signing the paper will save the world, he doesn't truly understand the legal nature of the transaction. In that situation, the contract may be void. Okay. So this protects mentally ill persons from exploitation. Without this protection, dishonest people could take advantage of vulnerable person and later say that they signed the contract, so they are bound by it, right? So we see how this goes, right? So the person who alleges mental illness must prove it. That's the onus, the onus of proof, the burden of proof. It lies with he who alleges, right? So if you allege that there was mental illness involved, you must prove it. So this means that if someone wants to escape a contract by saying I was mentally ill when I signed the contract, they must prove it, right? So they must prove three things at least. Okay. The first is that, they suffered from mental illness. And second is that the illness existed at the time of the act. Remember when I said timing is important? Yes, they must prove that the illness existed at the time of the act, right? And then number three, um, that the illness was serious enough to prevent them from understanding the nature and the consequences of the act. Okay, so if John signed a sale agreement on Monday, it is not enough to prove that he was mentally ill 6 months later or 6 months before. The issue is Monday. Was he mentally capable when he signed the contract on Monday? So that's where the legal focus is. Okay. So whether he was sick 2 years ago or mentally ill 10 years ago, 5 days ago, the main issue here is that he signed the contract on Monday. So we must deal with Monday to see whether he was mentally stable or he was mentally ill on that Monday. And that brings us to a very important topic, which is lucid interval. Okay, we will stop here and then we will talk about lucid interval in the next session of the video. Stay tuned and do not go away.